It was one of those picture-perfect Saturday mornings that made you forget the hustle and bustle of the week before. The air was warm but not too hot, just enough to make you feel comfortable in your favorite t-shirt and shorts. The sun hung, high in the clear blue sky, casting a golden glow over everything, making the trees seem more vibrant and the grass underfoot more inviting. It was the kind of day that screamed for outdoor play, and as usual, that meant I was at the park with my best friend, Jake. The neighborhood park had always been our weekend playground. It was our little haven where we could let loose, play games, and forget about everything else. The park wasn't big, but it was perfect for what we needed. A few grassy areas to run around on, a couple of benches for the parents to sit on, and a makeshift soccer goal set up between two trees at the edge of the park. It was nothing fancy, but to us, it was a field of dreams. We'd been playing soccer for a couple of hours, kicking the ball back and forth and trying to outdo each other with fancy footwork. The game had turned into an impromptu contest of who could score the best goal, and Jake, being the competitive one, was determined to win. We had made our goal posts with two tall trees, one on either side, and a line drawn in the grass to mark where the ball had to pass for a goal to count. Of course, neither of us cared much about the rules. It was all about having fun. That morning, Jake had been on a roll, scoring goal after goal, each one more impressive than the last. My defense wasn't terrible, but it definitely wasn't good enough to stop him. I had tried to block one of his shots, and the ball had slipped right past me and bounced off the tree with a satisfying thud. Jake had raised his arms in triumph and let out a loud cheer. It was one of those moments where you couldn't help but laugh, even though you were the one losing. Ha! Gotcha! Jake laughed, his grin wide. I shot him an exaggerated glare. Don't get too cocky. I'll get you next time. He kicked the ball back to me, his face still lit with the pride of victory. I lined up for my next move, determined to score at least one goal that would make me feel like I was still in the game. But just as I took a step forward to send the ball hurtling toward the makeshift goal, disaster struck. The ball flew off my foot with more force than I had intended and soared through the air high over Jake's head. It seemed to take forever before it came crashing down, right into the bushes that lined the edge of the park. Great, I muttered under my breath. There goes the ball, Jake groaned, throwing his hands up in mock frustration. Again? Come on, man. We've got to stop doing that. I wasn't paying much attention to his teasing. I was already heading toward the bushes, hoping that the ball hadn't gotten too far into the thick branches. The bushes were dense, with leaves that had gathered in clumps, and the thought of having to crawl through them to retrieve the ball didn't seem too appealing. Still, it wasn't like I had much of a choice. As I pushed through the bushes, I could hear Jake's voice in the background, still complaining about my terrible aim. But I didn't care. All I cared about was finding the ball so we could get back to playing. I reached down into the bush, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the ball. Relief washed over me. Thankfully, it was closer to the edge than I had thought. Just as I was about to pull the ball out, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, watch what you're doing!" I froze, the ball still clutched in my hand. It wasn't the voice of a kid, which was what I expected to hear from the other kids in the park. No, this voice was sharp, demanding, and completely unexpected. I turned around to see a woman standing behind me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had platinum blonde hair that cascaded down in waves, her large sunglasses perched on her nose, and a look on her face that screamed, "I'm in charge here." She didn't look like the kind of person who took kindly to disturbances. I stood up, the ball still in my hand, feeling a strange sense of unease. The woman didn't look happy, and her gaze was fixed on me with an intensity that made me shift on my feet. "We didn't mean to," I said quickly, trying to explain. My voice was a little shaky, more out of confusion than anything else. It just got kicked over there. We weren't—" "You better not damage those bushes," she interrupted, stepping closer, her voice growing sharper. "Those are private property." I've worked hard to keep them looking nice, and you're out here playing recklessly. You could have ruined them." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Damage? It was just a soccer ball. Sure, it had gone into the bushes, but it wasn't like we were trampling over anything important. It wasn't like we were out there with a lawnmower or digging up her precious flowers. I opened my mouth to respond, but the woman was already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, her fingers flying over the screen. "This is ridiculous. Kids these days have no respect for other people's property." "Wait, what?" I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could think better of it. No, there's no need for that. We'll move the ball, okay? It's just a mistake." But she wasn't listening. The woman's voice took on a strange, almost rehearsed tone as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, hello? I need the police," she said, her voice now oddly calm and collected. "There are 2 children here in the park. They've been playing too roughly and damaging my garden. They're destroying my plants, and I'm afraid they're going to cause more harm. You need to send someone immediately." I stood there utterly stunned. Jake, who had been trailing behind me, looked equally confused. He didn't know how to react either. We had been playing soccer, not vandalizing her property. It was hard to believe that anyone would take it this seriously. The woman finished the call, her eyes never leaving us. She put the phone down with a smirk that felt almost smug. "We'll wait here for the authorities," she said, crossing her arms tighter as if she were preparing for battle. Jake and I exchanged a look. I could see the confusion written on his face. This was beyond anything we had ever experienced. The last thing we expected was for someone to call the police over a stray soccer ball. "We didn't do anything wrong," I said, mostly to reassure myself. I wasn't sure why, but the woman's demeanor made me feel like we had somehow become the bad guys in this story. Jake shrugged, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. "What are we supposed to do now?" I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. The idea that the police were on their way, that someone had taken the time to dial 911 over something so minor, was mind-boggling. But there was no turning back now. The woman was standing firm, and the situation was spiraling out of control. We could either wait for the authorities and try to explain our side, or we could leave, but something told me this wouldn't be resolved easily. Either way, we were stuck in a mess we didn't create. The thought that our harmless game had turned into this made my stomach churn. What had started as a simple Saturday morning of fun had suddenly become a nightmare. I glanced at Jake, who was still staring at the woman as if he was waiting for something to change. But nothing did. She stood there, her phone still in hand, and a feeling of dread settled over me. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. Our Saturday was about to be a lot more complicated than I ever imagined. As I tried to wrap my mind around what had just happened, I heard the distant sound of sirens. My stomach dropped, and I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was real. The police were coming. The air felt thick with tension as I stood there, helpless, next to Jake, watching the woman clutch her phone like it was her lifeline, preparing for the arrival of the police. It seemed as though the situation was spinning out of control, and neither Jake nor I knew what to do next. The woman, still glaring at us, seemed convinced that she had us cornered. I couldn't help but feel embarrassed, unsure of how I had ended up in this mess. This wasn't the way I had planned my Saturday, far from it. Just as the weight of the situation began to settle in, I saw someone in the distance, a familiar figure walking toward the park. At first, I didn't think much of it, distracted by the woman's voice as she continued to mutter about us ruining her property. But as the figure drew closer, I realized it was my dad. Dad's tall, broad frame seemed to cut through the park, like he was a force of nature. His uniform was more casual than usual, but his presence was unmistakable. He had been away all week on a special assignment and had finally come home for the weekend. I couldn't believe the timing. He had no idea what was happening here, and yet as soon as he saw me standing next to the woman, something in his eyes shifted. He could sense that something wasn't right, and the calm, no-nonsense attitude that made him one of the most respected. Officers in the department immediately kicked in. "Dad!" I called out, relief flooding through me as I saw him approach. My voice, shaky from nerves, was probably too loud, but I didn't care. The minute I saw him, I felt like maybe everything would be okay after all. His expression softened when he saw me, but when his eyes shifted to the woman standing in front of us, they hardened. He didn't look at her with the same confusion I felt. There was no hesitation in his movement, no sign that he wasn't fully prepared for whatever this woman had been trying to start. His eyes narrowed just slightly as he sized up the situation. "What's going on here?" Dad asked, his voice steady but laced with authority. I swallowed hard, the embarrassment of the situation still making me feel small. "This woman is accusing us of ruining her property," I said, trying to explain. My words tumbled out in a rush. "But we were just playing soccer. We didn't mean to hurt anything." Dad glanced at the woman for a moment, assessing her from the corner of his eye, before turning his gaze back to me. The woman, seeing the authority in his posture, seemed to straighten up, as if she expected him to side with her. Her lips twisted into a smug smile, clearly pleased that she had someone on her side, or at least, that's what she thought. "Let me guess," Dad said, his voice now carrying the weight of years of experience. "You called the police, right?" The woman's smile widened, her face almost gleaming with the sense of victory. "Yes, that's right," she replied, her voice filled with exaggerated pride. "These children were kicking their ball around recklessly and damaging my garden. They need to be stopped before they cause more damage. It's only a matter of time." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about a garden. This wasn't about any property being damaged. It was about her overreacting, and now, in the most surreal turn of events, we were about to have the police involved for something as ridiculous as a misplaced soccer ball. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, wondering how much worse it would get. Dad's expression shifted slightly, his lips pressing into a tight line as he processed her words. He wasn't angry, but I could see the professional detachment in his eyes, a look that was familiar to anyone who had ever seen him on the job. He wasn't fazed by this woman's dramatics, and he wasn't about to let her make this situation worse than it already was. "Okay, then," Dad said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be here when they arrive." The woman's smile faltered for a moment, and I could tell that she wasn't expecting him to remain so collected. She had hoped to take control of the situation, but she hadn't anticipated that someone would stand in her way. She looked at Dad, her gaze momentarily shifting from the confidence of having made the call to a wary uncertainty. This wasn't some random passerby. This was a man who had spent his entire career in high-stakes situations. Nothing rattled him, least of all a woman trying to accuse two kids of a harmless mistake. "Sir, you don't understand," she said, her voice starting to crack. "These kids are—" Dad interrupted her, his tone calm but cutting through her panic. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you take a step back and let me handle this." His voice, though low, had a commanding quality to it that made the woman pause. The authority in his words was undeniable. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words seemed to die on her lips. I noticed that her body language had shifted. The confidence she had earlier was now replaced with hesitation. She was standing a little straighter, but there was no longer a smile on her face, no longer a sense of triumph. "You don't need to call the police over something so trivial," Dad continued, his eyes never leaving her. "These boys weren't causing any harm, and there's no reason to escalate this situation any further." The woman's face reddened, her earlier smugness slipping away. I could see that she was taken aback by my dad's calm, unshakable presence. I didn't know it at the time, but I was witnessing the way my dad could diffuse any situation with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words and the sheer force of his character. He wasn't angry, but he was firm, and there was no room for negotiation. "Sir," The woman started, her voice quivering. I'm just trying to protect my property. You don't know how much time I've put into making this park look nice. These kids don't care. They think it's their private playground. Dad didn't react to her words. He didn't try to argue with her or defend our actions. He simply stood there, silent, watching her. She fidgeted under his gaze, her body posture tightening as she struggled to maintain her ground. You're right, Dad said after a long pause, his voice even, but pointed. It's important to take care of your property. But what's more important is handling situations like this calmly, not blowing them out of proportion. He took a small step closer to her, closing the distance between them just enough to make her feel the weight of his presence. Now, I'll wait for the officers to arrive and we'll sort this out. But I'd suggest that you take a deep breath and think about how this could have been handled differently. The woman stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to find something to say, but nothing came out. There was nothing left for her to argue. My dad had effectively taken the air out of her sails, and without lifting a finger, he had placed her in a position where she was no longer in control. Jake and I both watched as the woman, suddenly aware that she wasn't going to win this confrontation, muttered something under her breath and took a step back. Her eyes flickered between Dad and me, and she seemed to shrink under his gaze. She glanced down at her phone, probably regretting her decision to call the police in the first place. There was no fight left in her. It was clear that Dad had won this round without raising his voice, without even breaking a sweat. I'll be here with you until this is resolved, Dad added, his tone reassuring now, aimed at me and Jake. No one's going anywhere. The woman didn't say another word. She just huffed and turned away, walking back toward the bench she had been sitting on earlier, her phone still in her hand. Her shoulders were slumped, and she no longer seemed so confident. I could tell she wasn't happy about how things were going, but she didn't have much of a choice. My dad had taken charge, and there was no room for her to escalate things any further. Jake and I stood there, still processing what had just happened. We had gone from playing a simple game of soccer to having the police called on us, to now, standing next to my dad who had single-handedly de-escalated the situation. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride in my chest. It wasn't the first time I had seen my dad in action, but it never ceased to amaze me how effortlessly he could take control of a situation, no matter how intense it was. As the minutes ticked by, I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance. They were coming, but Dad didn't seem worried. He was calm, composed, and in complete control. The woman had started to fidget again, checking her watch and tapping her foot, as if waiting impatiently for the officers to arrive. But Dad didn't react. He just stood there, his arms crossed, waiting for the police to show up and put an end to this whole mess. And when they did arrive, my dad's calm, authoritative demeanor ensured that everything was handled swiftly. What had started as a seemingly small misunderstanding was quickly cleared up, thanks to his presence. The officers, familiar with Dad's reputation, nodded to him and gave me and Jake sympathetic looks. They'd been through their own share of absurd calls, and this was just another one to add to the list. As the officers wrapped up their brief conversation with the woman, who had now grown quiet and seemed ready to leave, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The tension that had built up earlier slowly started to dissipate, and I could breathe easier once again. Thanks to my dad's quick thinking and no-nonsense approach, everything had been resolved with minimal drama. As the woman finally walked away, her shoulders hunched, my dad turned to us with a small smile. "That's how you handle a situation," he said, his tone light but still carrying the weight of experience. "Always stay calm, stay composed, and never let anyone else dictate how you react." I didn't need any more explanation. I already knew that my dad's lessons were worth their weight in gold. He had shown me that sometimes the best way to handle a situation wasn't with anger or force, but with calm, quiet authority. And with that lesson in mind, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the kind of dad I had. The sudden sound of sirens pierced the quiet of the neighborhood park, growing louder by the second. My heart skipped a beat as the flashing lights in the distance grew closer, signaling the arrival of the police. I could feel the anxiety creeping back, but something in my gut told me that everything was about to be okay. My dad was here, and with him came a sense of calm, a certainty that no matter what had happened up to this point, we were in good hands. 2 police cars pulled up in front of the park, their sirens cutting off as the vehicles came to a stop. The officers inside were calm, their movements efficient as they stepped out of their cars and looked around. Their eyes flicked from the woman, standing stiffly with her arms crossed, to my dad, who was standing a few feet away from me and Jake. The officers exchanged a quick glance before walking over to us, their expressions neutral but attentive. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his voice even as he surveyed the situation. He had the kind of professional demeanor that made it clear he had dealt with countless oddball calls like this before. His eyes moved from the woman to Dad, trying to assess the situation. Before I could say anything, the woman wasted no time in launching into her version of events. Her voice was high-pitched, almost frantic, and she didn't seem interested in hearing anyone else's side. "These boys are causing trouble," she said, pointing at Jake and me, her finger trembling slightly. "They've been kicking the ball around and damaging my garden. It's completely unacceptable. Someone needs to do something about this." Jake and I exchanged looks, both of us still reeling from the absurdity of it all. I couldn't believe that this woman was still trying to paint us as villains. There was no damage to her garden. We had barely even touched the bushes, let alone destroyed anything. It was as if she had decided that this minor incident was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she was determined to make us the scapegoats. The officers didn't immediately respond. They stood there for a moment considering her words before one of them glanced at my dad, who was standing with his arms crossed in his usual relaxed but commanding posture. My dad wasn't bothered by the woman's accusations. He knew exactly how to handle situations like this. "Officers," Dad said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm Detective Harris. I'm sure you're familiar with me," he continued, acknowledging the officer's unspoken recognition of his presence. My dad had been with the force for years, and his reputation preceded him. He wasn't just a regular officer. He was part of the SWAT team, someone the department relied on for high-stakes situations. "These kids were playing soccer," Dad continued, his tone unflappable. "Yes, the ball got kicked into the bushes, but there was no damage done to her property, and certainly no reason to involve the police. This is a misunderstanding." The officers nodded as they took in my dad's words. They had no reason to doubt him. He had a way of asserting his authority without ever raising his voice. They had seen him work under far more stressful conditions, and a minor park incident like this was nothing compared to the dangerous situations he was used to handling. One of the officers turned to the woman, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, we've looked into this," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of finality. "There's no real damage to your property. These boys didn't do anything wrong. It seems like a simple misunderstanding, and there's no need to involve the authorities any further." The woman's face turned a deep shade of red as she opened her mouth to protest. It was clear that she wasn't ready to let go of her sense of righteousness. She had already made up her mind that she was the victim here, and she wasn't about to be swayed by the facts. But before she could say anything, the second officer spoke up, his tone just as polite, but even more firm. "We recommend that you handle situations like this without involving the authorities next time," the officer said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. "Calling the police for something like this is an overreaction. There are better ways to resolve issues with your neighbors." I watched as the woman's mouth snapped shut. The words she had prepared now stuck behind her teeth. Her face flushed even deeper, and for a moment I thought she might say something even more outlandish, but she didn't. She just stood there, seething with frustration, knowing that she had lost this battle. Dad nodded in agreement with the officer. "Let's all remember, we're neighbors here," he said, his voice still calm but with an undertone of firmness. "There's no need to escalate things over a soccer ball. This should have been handled differently." The woman's glare was enough to make anyone uncomfortable, but Dad didn't flinch. He had dealt with far worse in his career, and a frustrated neighbor was nothing compared to some of the high-risk situations he'd faced. The woman finally, reluctantly, stepped back, muttering under her breath as she turned away from us. I could just barely hear the words she hissed to herself. "This isn't over," she muttered, her tone filled with venom. With that, the officers turned to Dad, clearly deferring to him now that the situation had been resolved. "Looks like you've got it under control, Detective Harris," one of the officers said, a small nod of respect in his voice. Dad gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's what I'm here for," he said with a touch of humor. "To keep things safe and to make sure no one makes a mountain out of a molehill." I couldn't help but smile myself, my nerves slowly unwinding as the weight of the drama that had unfolded seemed to lift. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding in until now. Everything had happened so quickly, and I hadn't known how it would turn out. But now, standing here with Dad, I knew that we were safe. I didn't have to worry anymore. As the officers finished up their conversation with the woman, who had started walking away, still muttering angrily to herself, I glanced over at Jake. He was still in shock, his eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. It was a lot for anyone to process, let alone a kid who had been minding his own business, only to find himself in the middle of an adult confrontation. The officers watched the woman as she walked off, their expressions reflecting the mild exasperation. That came with dealing with petty calls. They weren't going to waste any more time on this. It was clear to them that Dad had handled the situation perfectly, and now there was nothing more to be done. "Everything looks good here," the second officer said, turning back to us. He smiled at Jake and me, clearly understanding that we weren't the problem. "You boys just keep playing. No harm done?" "Thanks," Jake said, his voice still a little unsure, but grateful nonetheless. He wasn't used to being at the center of a police call, and I could tell he was still trying to process everything. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "It's over," he said softly. "Don't worry about it." As the officers climbed back into their patrol cars and drove off, the park began to feel a little more like it used to. The tension that had hung in the air had finally started to dissipate, and the usual hum of life in the park seemed to return. I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. With the situation wrapped up, we all started heading back toward the makeshift soccer goal. The ball was still lying in the bushes, and I bent down to grab it, brushing the dirt off as I straightened up. I felt lighter now that the drama was over, and I was ready to get back to what I loved doing, playing soccer with my best friend, without worrying about some angry woman accusing us of something we hadn't done. As we resumed our game, the ball kicked back and forth between Jake and me. I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of gratitude. My dad wasn't just a hero because of his job. He was a hero in the way he handled everything, the way he showed us that the small things in life mattered just as much as the big things. He didn't just teach me how to be strong in the face of danger. He taught me how to stay calm, how to handle the little setbacks with grace, and how to never let anyone push you around. And as for the woman, well, I had a feeling that this wasn't the last we would see of her. She might still be upset, still, holding on to her grudge, but I wasn't worried. My dad had handled it. He always would. With that thought in mind, I kicked the ball to Jake, and we resumed our game, the weight of the past few hours slowly fading as we laughed and played, just like we always did. Life, after all, had a way of working itself out when you had the right people by your side. And with my dad there, I knew I'd always be okay. For more gripping stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the HOA Stories and stay tuned for more.